Hello, everyone. I'm George Roska.
And I'm Mark Snyder.
And we want to welcome you to today's episode 175 of Say What, where we talk about the threats to our children in the public school system. But today, we want to share all of the great news that is coming about as a result of parents fighting for their children.
Yeah, it's not normal, George, for us to give good news to our audience, but we definitely have some today. And the good news comes in several different areas. One regarding the declining enrollment in the public school system. The challenges that the Biden administration is having getting their radical agenda regarding Title IX actually implemented. We're going to talk about some good news on that front. Then there's the whole area of school choice. And there's some new forms of schools that are starting to crop up. And I think this is going to be an encouraging episode for parents to let them know that when people start making noise and get involved, good things can happen.
Yeah, and people getting involved happens at all levels. And I think that's one of the other parts of this good news that I hope parents will really cling to, because, you know, when you and I keep on saying, parents, we must speak up, we must get involved.
Yeah.
Sometimes people might get the false notion that, oh, well, now I need to go and speak at a school board meeting, or now I need to go and, you know, go to the state capitol and do something.
Or I need to run for school board.
Or I need to run for school board.
Congress or something.
Well, if the Lord's calling you to that.
Oh, yes, we encourage it.
Yes, please do. But otherwise, I think a lot of the stuff is just parents doing their own local thing.
That's right.
And we'll see how, you know, this all comes together so beautifully. But, you know, Mark, one of the pieces of good news is the declining enrollment in public schools. And it's not that, you know, we want what's bad for kids, you know, because most people will say, like, well, how can you celebrate, you know, a declining enrollment? You know, public schools are for everyone, and they are, you know, one of the greatest goods ever to come out of America. But we've also been talking about how the public schools have been overtaken by radicals, by radical Marxists, and so we need to evacuate our children out of there and send more adults in there to fix the situation before we can ever have a conversation again about sending our kids.
Yeah, I mean, there's a reason, George, why we don't like monopolies, right? Because they hold too much power and they crowd everybody else out. And in the American system, this has happened sort of organically, but more recently by law. It's very difficult for parents to have any other choice but to send their kids to a public school. And once they do that, as the case the judge in Fields versus Palmdale School District says, your parent rights sort of end at the threshold of the school door. So it's a very ominous thing for parents to send their kids into public schools. And we have always believed, and we've maintained on this program, that a very healthy thing for schools in general would to see competition in the school system, which would mean declining enrollment in the public schools.
Yeah.
And George, I think you've got some good news to share on that front.
Some very good news. And, you know, this has actually been one of our goals at POK with our Get Out Now message, is to see this drop happen and to accelerate that decline. And so a very new report that just came out of the Manhattan Institute that is called Empty Desks, the Policy Response to Declining Public School Enrollment, has continued to reveal that the decline is going. It's accelerating, and it has been accelerating over the last few years, especially since POK got started. And I still remember, Mark, at that time we were having these conversations about, you know, our strategy and what are we ultimately after. And, you know, we really wanted to see a collapse, you know, of the public school system.
The way it's currently structured.
Of the way it's currently structured, and for it to be reformed, if it could be, into what it was intended to be from the very beginning.
And I think before you give the numbers, George, we should just mention that in many states, and California is one of them, the school's income is based on how many students they have in the school. And so when they have a monopoly and they have plenty of students, they can pretty much do whatever they want, which is not good for kids. It's not good for parents. But when parents have other choices and they start to de-roll their kids from the public schools for private schools or homeschooling, that puts pressure on the local school district and at the state level to start listening to parents, to start taking them seriously, and maybe consider reforms that otherwise they would not have.
So a couple of the key findings from this report was that the declining enrollment in public schools is a phenomenon that we now see across the entire country, with actually very few states seeing an increase. And overall, what we're actually seeing is that the deepest blue states are seeing the largest decline, whereas the deepest red states, are seeing the highest enrollment rates, increases. So New York, Illinois, California, 3 of the deepest blue states out there, they have seen the largest decline. And Mark, we talk about the goals that, we had set, right, with POK when we started in 2019. And here's this trend from the report looks at the last 10 years, and from 2013 to 2023. From 2013 to 2018, California was hovering at like 6.2 million. Pretty even, drops up, drop up, maybe tens of thousands difference. But something happened from 2018 to 2019, and it dropped by almost 40,000. It dropped into the 6.1. And then in 2020, it dropped even more. And then COVID hit in 2020. Parents started to see everything that's behind through the Zoom.
There was a silver lining to COVID, starting with the Virginia earthquake and sweeping across the country.
Yeah, I agree, Mark. And now, 2021, it dropped to 6.0. Then it went to 5.9. Now it's at 5.8. So California is seeing this decline. New York, similar trend. It went from 2.7 almost in 2013 to now down to 2.4. So 300,000, over 10% decline. In Illinois, it went from almost 2.1 to 1.76. Again, over a 10% decline. So this is the trend that we're seeing all across the country. Now, talk about states like Texas and Arizona. Texas, 10 years ago, was at 5 million. Today, it's at 5.5. It's just 300,000 kids away from overcoming California. California, by far, has the largest public school enrollment. Texas, probably in a couple of years, if these trends hold true, which we have no evidence to the contrary, Texas is going to be the largest state with the largest amount of enrolled kids in public schools. And so we're seeing this mass migration, right? What's causing all of this? It's not because, all of a sudden Californians are having less children and Texas is having more children. We talked about depopulation at our last, podcast, but we're seeing a migration trend from these deep blue states to red states. And that's most of what's happening here.
Yeah, it's a combination of things. And as much as we would like to say POK can take credit for alerting enough people to really take the public school threat seriously and remove their children, this is the result of lots of grassroots efforts across the country, raising their voices, getting directly involved themselves in school board meetings, running for school board, becoming activist parents on behalf of their children, and affecting legislation in public schools and raising awareness. I find it very interesting that at the same time in blue states, enrollment is decreasing. It's increasing in states where education is more conservative and traditional.
Yeah, and another data point, especially for the blue states and for the red states now, to dive a little bit deeper to see what do these numbers mean. What I found very helpful is if you look at the blue states, you look at their largest school districts, right? So California had 6.2 million kids 10 years ago. Now we're at 5.8. Well, what about the largest school district in California, which is LA Unified? And in Los Angeles, 10 years ago, you had 650,000 kids in the public school system. Now we are 100,000 less. That's 550. That is absolutely decimating imagine 100,000 kids over 10 years disappearing from all of these schools. That means you're closing down schools. You're merging schools together. You're doing things that you've never had to do before as a school district to adapt to, what's happening. That means there's, for those 100,000 kids, less butts and seats. The formula, right, that you were talking about earlier, that's less funding. That's less amount of teachers, right? If you just do a 30-to-1 ratio, which we know that classrooms these days in California have more than 30-to-1. They're probably closer to like 35 or 40. You subtract how many teachers are now needed. You subtract their teachers' union dues that they're paying. That is a lot of money that's leaving. Now, we are not naive about what's also happening in California, because we would expect a huge, massive layoff spree. That hasn't taken place.
I was going to ask about that. So you would expect that with decreasing enrollment, there would be a decrease in the administration state in schools. That you wouldn't have as many people in the back office, but that's not really true, is it?
That's not. In fact, what this report gives us insight into is it says that even with the decline in enrollment, the cost per child in public schools has gone up. And they just continue hiring more teachers and more administrators
which
for less
where
kids.
Their priorities are.
Exactly. That's their priority. Now, the other thing that's, I think very important to tell is, we had mentioned that you have this mass migration, right, from blue states to red states. However, what's also interesting is that when parents move from those blue states to the red states, they choose not to send their kids to the public schools of the deep blue pockets of those red states. So in Texas, for example, you have San Antonio, you have Dallas, you have Houston, you have Austin. These are like the massive 4 big cities. And in Texas, even though the state overall has seen an increase of 500,000 children, 500,000 more children, right, in their public school system, it's not coming in those
more progressive
cities. In fact, those school districts have seen a decline over the last 10 years. And so what's happening in those red states with those progressive cities in there is the mass migration that's coming is going out into the suburbs, into the redder areas. And we're also seeing parents and students leaving from the deep blue cities into the suburban areas where you have the better, choices for schools. So this report for me was very much a good news, because it's showing that parents are now voting with their feet. They're voting with their feet by choosing to leave a state to go to another state. But even parents in red states are voting with their feet by choosing to leave the city to go into the suburbs where they find much better schools that are not ideologically based.
Encouraging indeed, George, but we've got more good news, a related topic to be sure, but a little bit different, and that's the challenges to the Biden administration's changes in Title IX. The main point here is that the Biden administration wants to change the meaning of the word sex in Title IX, which is a civil rights law, which means you can't discriminate. When the law was first passed, it was meant to protect girls mainly in sports. But now they want to change it into sort of a gender identity instrument in the public schools by changing sex to mean one's perceived sex, gender identity, whether they think they're non-binary or binary or something else altogether.
Yeah.
And again, because of grassroots efforts, their implementation of their guidelines, their changes, is being challenged in the country, isn't it?
It definitely is. And Mark, you and I had done probably like 3 or 4 episodes in the past. So we encourage our listeners to do that. Go back and re-listen those or listen to them for the first time. But the good news that we're seeing as a result of parent groups, grassroots organizations that we've mentioned before, and one of them is Moms for Liberty. Right. And they actually filed a lawsuit in federal court against the Department of Education. And a couple of weeks ago, the Kansas District Court ruled actually in favor of Moms for Liberty, asking for an injunction on this rewrite of Title IX by the Biden administration. And in fact, the judge went so far as to say that in any school district in America that has a Moms for Liberty chapter or representation,
which I think they're in all 50 states.
They're in 45 states.
Okay, close to 50.
Yeah, they're in 2,000 schools across 45 states. That this, for now, the injunction applies to all of those areas, which is amazing. And parents, I mean, just think about it this way. Moms for Liberty just started right after COVID. They've only been around for like 3 years at most. And here is a parent, mom-led grassroots organization, right? 3 years ago, they probably would have never thought that this is the kind of impact they would have, in America, right? And yet, here's what we see. We see a ferocious group of what they call themselves the Joyful Warriors, and they're fighting like crazy to make sure that these kind of, absolutely absurd and insane, rewrites of our laws that the Biden administration is pushing for, that there's roadblocks to them and that they're stopped. And here we are with an amazing news like this.
And of course, other groups besides Moms for Liberty pushing to make sure that these guidelines are never implemented. If they went unchallenged, of course, they would be implemented in January of next year in 2025. But even aside from the Moms for Liberty cases, there are federal judges across the country that have also enjoined the implementation of this. Again, George, the direct result on parents making noise.
Yep. So parents continue making that noise. And here's the third piece of good news. The juggernaut of the school choice movement continues to advance at the state level. That's where the battles are being fought. And a couple months ago, we just got our 12th state.
It's amazing.
That passed universal school choice. And all of this has happened in the last 3 years with, West Virginia and Arizona becoming the first ones. There were major, roadblocks that were placed and challenges in court. They won, all of those challenges. And since then, you had this domino effect that has just spread across the country, with now Louisiana being that 12th state that just passed universal school choice.
And by school choice, we mean usually one of two different schemes. It's either a voucher system or what they call an educational savings accounts, where the state gives for parental control money that would otherwise go to a local school district for the education of their children directly to the parent to be used in the school of their choice, given some requirements, but normally a private school in good standing, an accredited private school.
Yeah.
And parents are starting to make those choices. Not only starting to make those choices, George, but to demand the freedom to make those choices. After all, they're taxpayers. They're paying into the system. They should have a say in how that educational money is spent.
And in fact, Mark, some more good news on this school choice related topic. I had friends who moved to Florida, and this was shortly after, the pandemic. Florida enacted school choice. What they are telling me out of Florida is that it's hard you have to get on waiting lists now for private schools, because the private school system can't react fast enough to create capacity for the demand that they are seeing. And I was last month on a webinar for the North American Mission Board, and we'll talk about them a little bit more later. But as it relates to school choice, one of the persons on that webinar who is from Florida was making this same claim as well, that from his experience, what he's seeing now over the last couple of years is the demand is greater than the supply. And he is basically asking churches to step in and saying, you have to step in here and fill in that demand need, provide that capacity through your churches. So it's amazing to see this, that now out of these 12 states, we are seeing parents, being given that freedom to choose which school they can send their child to. But more than that the money follows the child, and that the money's not locked up in, how you said it, the monopoly of the public school system. So the more good news that's on the horizon for school choice, Mark, is that over this last election cycle, right, in the primaries, I know we still have the presidential cycle coming up, but in the primaries, a lot of red states had their own state level for their assemblies and their senates, right? Texas was one of the big red states that still hasn't had school choice passed. And Governor Abbott basically ran on this ticket.
I remember this.
That we will pass school choice. Now, he's tried over the last two legislative cycles to pass it in his state. And guess what? He's had 21 Republicans stand in his way. Out of those 21 Republicans, 15 have been voted out in this last election cycle. And parents in those local districts at the state level have basically put up candidates to run that better reflect their values and their desire for school choice. And out of, it's 11 out of the 15 that were opposing it. 11 out of the 15 got replaced. And now Governor Abbott has said that he has the votes that he needs, with just out of the Republican side. No Democrats need to vote because they have enough of the majority there. So now we can imagine that 5.5 million kids will now be given access to universal school choice. Parents of these children will be able to send them to the school of their choice. That's just absolutely amazing.
It's great news, George, and a bit of a plug. POK offers help for pastors who may be listening, who may be considering, well, maybe I should start a private school on my church campus. And we have a publication called How to Start a Private School. And we highly recommend church-based schools that you can get by going to our website. You can request copies to it, and we're happy to provide it to you. And we have other resources as well to come alongside pastors who are considering starting a private school on their premises.
And that is the fourth piece of good news.
That's the fourth piece.
Parents, pastors, you can continue doing this. And usually, if not every month, every other month, because of how we're connected through these network of other like-minded organizations with POK, we get connected to new organizations that we find out about, and we get to hear their story.
We do.
And two of those, for me, over the last 2 months, has been the North American Mission Board. Mark, it just so happened that on my Facebook feed, I get an advertisement from them. And for our listeners who are not familiar with the North American Mission Board, this is the missional arm of the largest evangelical denomination in America, which is the Southern Baptists. And we've been trying to get pastors to, get up and do what's right, fight for our children. Well, now the North American Mission Board, they actually put on a webinar last month in July 2024, where they had a pastor there. They had the Association of Christian Schools International, their president, which is an accrediting organization for private Christian schools. And they had a school headmaster who's actually running a very successful private Christian school in Florida. And they were basically doing what POK was doing. They were outlining for their Southern Baptist members, and typically pastors, that's their main audience, on how they too can start some form of school, a private school, a micro school, a hybrid, whatever. And they were just outlining options and success stories of how, this has been done before and how they can do it too. So just amazing news to see finally one of the largest organizations and denominations in America really seeing the big picture now.
George, this is such great news. 4 different areas, but all, again, the result of parents deciding to become activists and taking personal responsibility for how their children are educated. So I think this should be greatly encouraging to our listening audience that your time has not been wasted these last years, that your efforts are starting to bear fruit in very tangible and significant ways, that if it continues, I think we can continue also to see very good news on these different fronts.
And Mark, one other point here on this last one of starting up, micro schools and private schools. You might say, well, George, that's the North American Mission Board. They are huge. They have a lot of resources. What can I do? Well, I have a second piece of good news on this front. Just in the last month, I got connected to another organization called the Heartland HERO. And HERO is an acronym, HERO, standing for Heartland Education Reformation Organization. And this is actually a nonprofit out of Kansas. And it's a group that helps connect churches and educators who want to start or support what they call creative Christian learning environments. This is a bunch of local pastors in Kansas with a bunch of local Christian educators who have come together and put their minds together and say, hey, look, if there's a willing church, and pastors will find those willing churches, we as educators will find a willing expert and educator to come alongside that local pastor and that local church and help you start some form of a school that works for that church. And so this isn't just big organizations finally looking at our cultural moment and saying we must do something. It's also your small church pastor, your local church pastors, and your local educators who are seeing the moment that we are living in and saying, we have to do something. We're going to stand up. And they created this organization called the Heartland HERO.
I love it, George. This is the best kind of change when local volunteer organizations who are closest to the problem decide to get together and to take combined action. And when that happens, wonderful things take place, and we're starting to see the fruit of those efforts. Again, just a personal plug for POK. If you're an attendee of a church who is very interested in perhaps starting a private school at your local church, or you're a pastor listening to this program and you want to know what resources are available to you, please visit our site at pok.org. And we have tremendous resources to help you in that regard. You can send us an email posing whatever question you have, and we will respond accordingly and ensure that you get the help that you need. Well, George, I appreciate the work you've done in putting this research together. This is encouraging indeed.
It definitely is, Mark, and just wanted to throw it out there for parents and for pastors. You can do it. You have the ability. God will supply for all of the needs, and where God guides, He provides. So we'll talk to you next time on Say What?